What was the worst mental breakdown you've ever witnessed? Disassociation slash depersonalization. When you experience high degrees of anxiety and stress, your brain finally reaches a point where it goes, you know what, we can't handle this. Time to check out. And then it proceeds to dump a bunch of chemicals in your bloodstream. Some people feel like they're watching a movie. Some feel like they're floating. Some won't feel real. Some won't feel like they're inside their body. And in more serious cases, will feel so detached from their own mind that they experience a sort of amnesia where their identity is a foreign concept. I get it from time to time if I get a particularly bad anxiety attack. For me, it's actually quite pleasant. I feel like I always describe it as watching a movie from the back of your brain through a Vaseline-smeared lens. It's not like how the main character in Get Out is pushed into the black floating ether, watching his life through a distant screen. It's not literally like that, but you just feel so distant from reality that it feels like it. So I'll always just feel floaty and spacey. The feel-good neurotransmitters being dumped into my blood help with that. I just go from, snap. Oh, everything's weird and fuzzy and far. La-di-da, going on my way now. However, it's terrifying for some people. It can be unpleasant as F. Some people experience a form of dissociation so intense that they believe they're dead. Hannibal covered it in an episode once. Pretty interesting stuff. So, never experienced this myself, but based on the way OP described it here, it almost sounds like it's giving you an effect similar to like psychedelic drugs. So just like a temporary high and escape from, reality, I guess. So I can see how that could freak you out, but I could also definitely see how some people might enjoy it a bit. Story 3. Definitely the first one I ever saw. I was the only kid home, probably 14 at the time, and heard my parents arguing very, very loudly. I was fed up with it, so I thought, F it, why not confront them? I burst out of my room and looked down over the stairway/entrance to find my mom completely naked, screaming at the screen front door. I froze for a while and realized that she was having some sort of flashback to the day her father left her family when she was a kid. She was screaming, Daddy, Daddy, please, please don't go, come back, in a truly nightmarish wail. That was the first time I witnessed one of her psychotic breaks. Unfortunately, since then, I've had more practice than any child should trying to care for her during those episodes. Story 4. My third grade teacher melted down in class when the Challenger exploded. It was supposed to be an exciting day. They had wheeled in the media cart with that old CRT beauty strapped to the top. When the shuttle blew up and the boosters flew off wildly, even us 8-year-olds could tell that doesn't seem right. Then we heard her crying and looked to the back, and she was on the floor, just hysterical. She was crying so hard we couldn't talk to her. She went between catatonic and hysterical for a couple minutes. There was one of those phones on the wall that looked like a rotary dial phone without the dial. We weren't supposed to touch it, but we knew if you picked up, it automatically called the office. After some, but we'll get in trouble type debating, myself and another kid, do you Reddit, and Patrick, we were solid under pressure that day. Picked it up and told the office lady, Mrs. So-and-so is crying really hard and won't talk. We don't know what to do. They were in the process of getting the buses there to let school out early, if I recall correctly, but a few minutes later, the school nurse and the assistant principal came in. The teacher left with the nurse and the AP sat with us and answered questions until we were dismissed. We didn't hear the teacher again for a couple of months. She had been very excited about the shuttle launch and the teacher getting to go into space. Rumor I heard as I got older was she had also been in the middle of a nasty divorce/custody battle at that time. The shuttle was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she had a nervous breakdown. I have no idea if the stuff about her personal life is true, but I definitely think we witnessed a breakdown. She was always one of my favorite teachers, and she still was when she came back. I hope life turned out okay for her. TLDR, space shuttle came apart, third grade teacher came apart. Edit, obligatory, wow, this blew up. You guys inspired me, and I tried to look up my teacher. I'm pretty sure I found her, but unfortunately, rest in peace. She was a great teacher with a compassionate heart, and now I'm bummed out. Edit 2. No, wow, this blew up was not on purpose, but I feel like it stays in now. I tried to look up Patrick. My family moved out of state after 4th grade, so I haven't seen or spoken to him in 30 years. No luck. But I did find a 17-year-old girl on Facebook from the same town with the same last name. Briefly weighed the merits of me, almost 40, messaging a 17-year-old to ask, who's your daddy? Then explaining to the police, there was a space shuttle in this Reddit thread and so I decided against it. If he read it and sees this, it was meant to be. On that note, RIP, my inbox full of false Patricks. If it's really you, PM me with the name of the teacher in the school. Thanks, Reddit. This made for an interesting morning. Story 5. Back when I was in college, there was a girl in my English class that got into a shouting match with the professor over the correct pronunciation of the word Newfoundland. This girl was screaming, calling the professor an idiot because he didn't pronounce it Newfoundland. She wouldn't have it any other way. When the professor humored her and asked the class to raise their hands if they thought he was pronouncing it correctly, everyone around her raised their hands. She began screaming, like calling everyone an idiot, and she dropped on the floor and began roll-begging God to punish her enemies. Campus security dragged her out of the class, screaming and yelling. Then the professor continued with his lecture as if nothing had happened. We never saw her again. Edit. Since people are asking, this was in California back in the fall semester of 2001. We hadn't even gotten her textbooks yet. Wherever she is, I hope she got the help she needs and is doing better. Edit. Guys, the argument was not about the nuanced pronunciation of a single word. She was adamant it was pronounced as 3 separate words. Story 6. My aunt has struggled with mental illness her whole life, but when her husband of nearly 40 years left her, she spiraled pretty quickly. The family was notified by a neighbor that they hadn't seen her for weeks, and when the house was entered, she had defecated in several rooms and would only crawl along the floor. She's been hospitalized ever since. Yeah, that sounds like beyond just the breakdowns that we've read before. This just sounds like she's lost her mind, and hate to hear it. She is totally cracked. Ugh. That's awful. Story 8. My ex had a severe panic attack one night and went outside in just boxers in the middle of the winter, lay down in the snow in the fetal position and cried. I had never experienced this before, and it freaked me out as I wasn't sure how to deal with it. He didn't seem to recognize me or his surroundings. I managed to get him into the house, and after some time he snapped out of it. He didn't remember it happening. Story 10. I had a French teacher lose it when a kid said the class made her want to unalive herself. Next thing we know, the teacher is sobbing and proceeds to tell us all about her failing marriage, her husband's opioid addiction, and how she can't even afford therapy because the school slashed the health plan again. I quietly gave her the card for my old therapist who worked on sliding scale fees after class. Story 11. A buddy of mine would lose his temper for about 10 seconds and would just go completely out of control, yelling, throwing tools or whatever was around him across the room and cursing. Afterwards, he'd be really embarrassed about it, but I several times worried about him hurting someone who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Edit. I've had about 40 people responding saying they suffer similar episodes or people they're close to do. I honestly had no idea it was this common. A few have mentioned intermittent explosive disorder, which can be helped with cognitive behavioral therapy. A few have mentioned it graduating from semi-harmless to abusive in nature. So if you feel like it's getting worse, make sure you seek help before the Hulk version of you does something regular you regrets. Story 12. Had a friend who was the nicest guy, polite, hard worker, rarely drank, and only in moderation. He never cursed, had a great relationship with everybody, and I don't think I ever saw him get mad. I was at his place one day with his roommates when he got home from work. He yelled at us to shut the F up. He went to the fridge and grabbed 2 beers, pounded those, slammed the fridge, went to his room and slammed the door. His roommate goes to check on him to see what's wrong. His roommate also happens to be a paramedic. He quickly diagnosed the problem as physiological. We zip-tied his hands, threw him in the car, and sped to the hospital. He was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm and put into a medically induced coma. While the family was notified and the debate was had over whether surgery was appropriate, he passed away. Edit. To clarify, we only cuffed him when he refused to go willingly. Since there were 4 of us, we were able to do it without hurting him. Story 13. My father was in the hospital for 4 months total due to brain damage, among many other issues. When he finally got to come home, he completely lost his shot a couple times over really trivial things. One of the worst times was over a blanket. We had thrown out a white blanket about a year before. He came into the living room and started screaming about the blanket. He threw things, flipped the couch over, and had a crazed fit for over an hour. He just wouldn't hear anything anyone had to say to him. Eventually, he almost fainted. Story 15. When I was 10, my mother had a breakdown and spent an entire night hitting and kicking me, making me tell her I hate her and screaming. She had broken her leg a few months before, and on top of a chronic condition, she was no longer able to work. Seeing my mom turn into this horrible monster terrified me, and later that night she had cooled down, gave me a couple painkillers, and cried while apologizing. I'll still never forget how she looked the entire time she was doing that. Story 16. My mother is currently in a psych ward. We thought she had been talking to someone who wasn't there, but she'd just say she was talking to herself when we asked. She had a history of mental health issues. Last Friday, she started screaming at someone named Rose who wanted to drag her to hell, and she didn't want to go. My dad took her to the ER. She hasn't been in for just over a week and has showed some improvement, but is still talking to her. Rose is telling her she's in trouble and is telling her to not tell her family she loves us. Going to visit her soon. Hopefully she's doing a bit better today. Story 17. This lady I used to work for once told me about her college roommate who had a childlike regression-style breakdown. Apparently her mom was one of those pageant moms and was super hard on her during her childhood, which gave her some serious deep-seated issues. My former boss, her roommate, and a couple of friends were getting ready to go out for a night on the town, and the roommate just starts sobbing and talking like a little girl about how her mom buys her panties with butterflies on them. They wound up having to call the girl's mom to come get her because she was freaking out so bad, like crying unconsolably in the corner bed. She dropped out shortly after. Story 18. Didn't personally witness this, but we had a teacher in middle school who was basically a huge pushover. It was well known he didn't know how to control the class, and obviously little craphead 13-year-olds took advantage of that. Anyway, one day he snapped and threw a chair through the window panel next to the front door of his classroom. Never saw the teacher again. Alright, well that escalated rather quickly, guys. Find an outlet, some kind of outlet to vent your frustration. Bottling it up is literally the worst thing that you can do. Gosh, hate to hear that. Story 19. Years back in high school, we had this French teacher. She was usually very nice, but could snap at the slightest of things. For some reason, everyone effed with her in the class. We weren't allowed phones in class, so we pretended to text on our pencils. She would call us out and we'd just throw her the pencil. Cue the freak out. One morning, my friend Adam got called out on his pencil texting. Our French teacher stood up, screamed loudly in complete gibberish like some bat-out-of-hell demon, and ran towards him, snapped his pencil in half, threw it at him, and then ran out of the classroom screaming about cats and pushing students out of the way. She never came back. I think maybe she had some underlying mental issues, but it was the craziest breakdown I've ever seen. Edit. This happened like 13 years ago. We were 12 to 13 years old. Kids do dumb crap. Don't act like you didn't too. Edit 2. This happened in England, hence me being 12 to 13 and in high school. Story 20. My father had alcohol detox-related dementia twice. The first time for a couple weeks, the second time for months. He recovered each time almost fully, but it was bad. Full hospitalization / skilled nursing facility bad. Story 21. Was doing a 3-year prison sentence and was put into solitary confinement for assaulting someone. Someone else in there went on hunger strike and stopped taking their bipolar medicine. He slowly deteriorated into insanity, started smearing his own crap on the walls in his cell, his body, throwing it at people as they walked by his cell. Basically, anything someone could do with their own crap, he did. Story 22. Well, I worked in a psych ward for over 10 years, so it's hard to narrow it down. The most personally disturbing ones for me were actually not the ones where people became floridly psychotic, shouting and crying, etc., but the ones where they were able to hold it together enough to have a normal conversation. Yet, if you scratch the surface a little, they'd tell you that the voices were telling them to kill you right this moment and exactly what they wanted to do to you. It was like some kind of horrid, real, robotic version of the Stepford Wives, where on the surface everything was fine, but underneath, whoa. Story 23. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had chemistry first period. Everyone was tired and nobody was really in any mood to answer the questions. After the teacher asked a question and no one gave the answer, after 30 seconds, her face got all red and she started freaking out and screaming, "How am I supposed to know that I'm a good teacher if you guys won't answer the questions?" And essentially, she sat there and cried for the remainder of the period. She wasn't a terrible teacher, but she was very unstable. Story 25. I got to watch someone quit at Taco Bell once. He said, "I'm clocking out anyway," hopped over the counter, flipped the chair, threw a taco at the window, and stormed out. Me and the other customers looked at each other with a mutual, what the F just happened face. Story 26. In the funeral of two siblings, sister 16, brother 15, he was driving and lost control of the car, ended up under a truck that carried sand. At the funeral, the mom was crying and just bawling her eyes out. It's something that stuck with me, and it was over a decade ago. I was 15. It got so bad, they had to inject some kind of Xanax. I don't know. She went from screaming and crying to just being there, sitting in silence and, numb. Edit. Redaction, and for those who wonder, she's kind of okay, if you can say so, now. Still, her eyes have lost their spark. I think that's every parent's worst nightmare, is outliving their children for whatever reason, so absolutely empathize there. That's horrible. Story 27. The day that my father passed away, we were all very emotionally drained and went home to rest. My grandmother, mother's mother, went for a nap, and when she woke up, she had no recollection of Dad passing away, or even being sick. She insisted that he was perfectly fine and we were all joking. She had no idea how she got there, or of many events that had happened leading up to that moment. So, on the most heart-wrenching day of my life, I had to reiterate to my grandmother every 5 to 10 minutes that my father had passed and the story of what had happened. We took her to emergency after a couple hours, and everything seemed to be fine. A couple days later, she was back to normal. Still the freakiest thing I've ever witnessed. Story 28. I was with my ex-wife, and she had to put her heroin-addicted mom in the nursing home. While we were there, her mom, who had damaged her liver so much she was toxic and confused, asked her, "Why are you doing this to me?" And she replied with, "I'm not. You did this to yourself by not quitting heroin." It went downhill from there. Ugh, depressing. Story 29. My roommate in college, one day she just snapped, got really paranoid, started lashing out at me and other friends. Would be hanging out in other people's rooms and just wouldn't leave. She wouldn't sleep and said she was afraid someone would try to come in the room and take advantage of her. Trying to talk to her was really unnerving because there was just a disconnect that's hard to describe, and the stuff she was saying just didn't make sense. Her mom eventually came down, and I guess she was making a scene with her on campus. Campus police came, and she ended up getting in a fight with them and kicked a window out of one of their cars. This all happened over the course of a few days. She was hospitalized for a while and had to leave school. She was always a little emotional and had some family problems, but it was all pretty shocking and unexpected. I really think it was a combo of drinking and too much recreational Adderall that brought it on. She was always a bit of a partier and had been doing it right before it all started. It was pretty scary and sad. I never saw her again, and I'm not sure how she ended up. Story 30. Witnessed a complete crap show of a mental breakdown at McDonald's. An employee got overwhelmed by lunch hour traffic and started screaming and yelling and swearing in front of kids and a police officer. Even pushed an elderly employee who fell down, and she was promptly taken away by the officer. All went down in less than a minute. Story 31. Mentally ill neighbor lady had a complete meltdown in front of my house. I helped her while police and medics were summoned. Later, I told one of the cops that I'd never seen anyone, outside of a movie, go that completely insane. His muttered response chilled me. Every day. Every day. Story 32. The Legend of the Keymaster. I worked at a large gaming company for a few years. We had this odd guy, a bit pudgy and very greasy. He collected keys and taped them to the top of his monitor. One day, he got a ticket back from a dev telling him the bug he had would not be fixed. He lost it. He threw back his head and screamed and then headbutted his monitor. Keys flew everywhere, and as he pulled back for another go, blood splattered in shocking amounts. He had a key buried in his forehead under the skin. This startled him. He pulled it out slowly, looked at it, and then us. Our looks of horror must have set him off. He started stabbing himself over and over with it. After about 10 to 20 stabs, he roars again and tears start streaming down his face. He chucks the key at us and runs out the door, never to be seen again. Story 33. My own, but only because I haven't really seen any of the serious ones other people are talking about. Essentially, I was 16, in high school, and dealing with some serious mental health issues, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, paranoia, hallucinations, etc., and it got to the point that I couldn't stop vomiting, couldn't recognize myself in the mirror, tore up my skin from scratching to get the things out, and missed a lot of school because I was certain that if I left the house, something awful would happen. Good times. Story 34. 9/11. My first period math teacher did not handle it well. I was 14. We were all stunned and scared. My teacher was wailing, pulling her hair out, running in and out of the room. Her husband had died in the line of duty at some point, and his flag was on display in her room. She broke open the display case and even dragged open the folded flag. She began weeping into the flag and hugging it to her. Eventually, I got another teacher and told them our teacher needed to be removed. It took 3 teachers to essentially drag her from the room. She was gone for 2 weeks. She always didn't like me, but after that, she hated me and gave me detention every day. Story 35. I was hooking up with a guy when I was about 16 who was suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness. I guess it was bipolar or schizophrenia looking back on it. He was older and going to college in the city, so I'd visit him whenever I'd take the train down. In the beginning, he was pretty okay, though he'd always walk around wearing plaid pajama bottoms and a big, puffy, mustard yellow parka, and had some quirky personality traits. The school he was attending was filled with weird art kids, so this was dismissed as him being eccentric for a while. I remember after hanging out with him for a day while he was dressed like a disheveled, sleepy hobo, we turn a corner and there's a movie premiere his dad had invited him to, like a fancy Hollywood movie premiere. He rolled his eyes, explained that his dad was making him go, waved goodbye and wandered away, just attending the black tie event in his PJ bottoms and parka. Every time I visited, his dorm room became more and more disorganized. He became more erratic, and he started placing candles everywhere. He started to become obsessed with the new age/Eastern spirituality and was convinced he was some kind of shaman. He only talked about third eyes, his psychic abilities, summoning spirits, etc. He had a very sweet roommate this entire time who was acting as his caretaker. He was so nice, just humoring him and shooting me sympathetic grimaces, entertaining me and acting as the host whenever my friend disappeared to go suddenly pursue whatever thought had just popped into his brain, etc. I was too young to really be able to handle that situation well, and thank God he was there. Not sure why I didn't break off the FWB situation. I wasn't invested, but I think I didn't want to cut off ties with a person who was clearly spiraling. The last time I visited him, he'd created a shrine in his room to, no joke, his self-pleasuring rag. He'd set up a fairly intricate shrine in the middle of the dark room with this crusty flannel placed lovingly in the middle, surrounded by incense and candles. The sweet roommate explained what the deal was as my FWB lay prostrate on the floor, and 16-year-old me was finally like, I'm really not properly equipped to deal with this. Time for me to leave. His parents eventually caught on to the fact that this was mental illness, not eccentricities. Came down and collected him. Saw him a handful of times after that. He was always quirky, but never got as bad as that period of time. He actually gained quite a bit of weight, so I assume he'd been put on antipsychotics. Poor dude. Story 36. My own. It was when I was working a desk job that just got more and more stressful due to being exploited. My uncle scored me the job, being a manager there, and it was a pretty straightforward desk job. Reply to emails, do a few spreadsheets, easy stuff, and my uncle made sure none of the other people in management exploited me, like giving me more tasks they didn't want to do. Then he got laid off by the owners, and I instantly lost my support. Suddenly, I reported to 3 different people, had to run around the warehouse like a madman. One of my bosses wanted me to start doing tax-based stuff, something I wasn't trained for nor hired in for. He'd ask for graph charts of our stock, but not explain what he wanted correctly, so I'd have to do the damn thing 5 times until he was happy. No one considered me a friend because they all worked on the production floor and I was a desk jockey. A lot of them considered me management's female dog boy. Anyway, one day I woke to get ready for work and I just felt off. Like there was this dread looming over me. I got to work and it only got worse. Didn't help my bosses wanted a bunch of ambiguous reports that made no sense and I couldn't deal with getting grilled at that point. As the day went long, I got more and more anxious. Got the shakes, and at one point the vision in my left eye went out. But I knew it was bad when I looked out the glass doors to the extremely busy street full of trucks and honestly considered walking out onto the road instead of being there. I submitted my work, only for it to be rejected, switched off my PC and bolted. Got home and just broke down. Came to the realization that the job wasn't worth my life and spent the next few days talking to a doctor and setting up going back to college. Was perhaps the lowest point I ever got to, and I never want to be that way again. TLDR, there's a difference between working a crappy job and working a job that's literally killing you, mentally and or physically. Story 37. Oh God, my now ex-boyfriend. He smoked a lot of pot, which is fine, but it made him so paranoid and anxious that he couldn't fully function. And then it got to the point that the paranoia and anxiety started to happen when he wasn't smoking. He hid it well in the beginning, and then I got a call from his best friend slash boss asking if I knew where he was because he'd done a no-call no-show at work that day. I stopped by his house. The door was ajar, and his cat was wandering around the hallway crying. I went into his apartment and was terrified I was going to find him hanging from the rafters. But he wasn't there, neither was his car. His wallet was, and there was a knife open on the counter, and his phone was smashed on the floor. So I called his friend, called the police, sat down, and waited. Once all of that was over, I went home and waited to hear something. Eventually, I heard from him and found out that he had had a paranoid episode, became convinced that he had AIDS, drove to the hospital, and started screaming and trying to fight in the hospital lobby. He ended up in 4-point restraints and had to get to the point of normalcy before they could let him call anyone, since he had no ID and was acting completely insane. The hospital set him up with a therapist, and in the next coming months, he became convinced he was the son of God, left all of his apartment sliding doors open for the snakes, and just continued to mentally decline. Turns out, he was bipolar and had a psychotic manic episode. He refused medication, we broke up, and I still get text messages and phone calls from all of his random numbers 4 years later. Also, turns out he thought he had AIDS because he was effing 4 other women. So F you, Steve, you crazy son of a female dog. Story 38. I was about to go into a building for a lecture when I saw a girl sitting on a park bench. Something made me ask her if she was okay, and at that, she burst into tears. She told me that everyone was turning into demons. For some reason, she knew that I was not a demon. Obviously, she was schizophrenic and hallucinating, but it was interesting to me to observe someone whose religious education was providing input into their hallucinations, which I believe is not uncommon. I helped her calm down and then to call her sister. I waited with her until her sister arrived to help her some. I had so much respect for this girl. Going to class was so easy for me, but she had to struggle through so much to come to college. When you have mental or emotional problems, it's easy to think you're less than others. But the fight you put up on days you can makes you a giant and equal to anyone. Story 39. A kid in high school drove his truck straight into a cement bottom light pole. He was a sports star, valedictorian, very popular guy who everyone loved. He and his girlfriend broke up and he snapped. He was out of school for over a year and he very nearly died. When he came back, he was still a really nice guy, but much more subdued than he had been before. I hope he's doing okay. Story 40. When I was little, I spent every weekend with my grandma and grandpa. We'd visit their neighbors sometimes. They were really religious and just generally beautiful people. They were the kind of couple that you knew were soulmates, just clearly made for each other. My dad called them Ned and Maud Flanders. Unfortunately, the husband got cancer. The doctors didn't expect him to survive it, but as I expect one would, he decided to go through chemo anyway and hope he would beat the odds. Surprisingly, he did, but the journey through sent him spiraling into a really dark place. He started drinking and picking fights with his wife. Then he started getting paranoid and accusing her of all sorts of things. She was infertile, and he began to blame her for not being able to have children. Eventually, she left him, and he would turn up on her doorstep drunk and angry. He started not only stalking her, but stalking her parents, calling them and slandering her viciously. Last we heard, he was basically homeless. She ended up selling the house because she was too heartbroken to live there anymore. It was so incredibly sad to see that happen to them, and in the turn of over a year or two. Story 41. A friend, a Vietnam veteran medic, told me he had been ordered by the president to go to Hanoi to kill bin Laden. He showed me the knife he had been issued to do the job. After he killed bin Laden, he was to poison Hanoi's water supply. Another time, God told him to kill all the drug dealers in town. He called the chief of police to ask where he should stack the bodies. He was hospitalized both times, and several other times. Story 42. Myself, quite recently. Me and my boyfriend had a lovely date, and whilst walking home, we were harassed by 2 different groups of people who were drunk and looking for a fight. I have depression, anxiety, and severe body dysmorphia, and this just tipped me over the edge. I started screaming that I just couldn't live anymore. It resulted in me blacking out and my boyfriend having to carry me home. Next thing, I'm on my living room floor puking my guts out because I overdosed on my medication. Not fun. With my brother, he was a heroin addict but is now in rehab. His girlfriend split up with him due to his addiction and he got really drunk. He came home and was smashing the whole kitchen up looking for alcohol. He was screaming at me and my mom and her boyfriend, and eventually the police were called by the neighbors. It took 4 policemen to restrain him, bearing in mind he's a skinny guy, and they practically had to drag him out of the house where he proceeded to smash his head into the ground. I don't like talking about these things, but sometimes it's fair to air the laundry, you know? Story 44. I don't know if this counts because it's my own, but whatever. When I was 14, I was hospitalized for almost unaliving myself. While I was in the psych ward, I completely melted down. I cried all the time. I could barely sleep. I felt nauseous all the time. I was shaking so hard, I remember spilling water in my lap, just trying to bring styrofoam cup to my lips. I had a meltdown and refused to eat for a little while, in the hopes I would just die. When it was visiting hours every day, I couldn't control myself. I remember crying and begging my parents to either take me out of that place or just let me die. Normally, I have fairly good control over how I express my outward emotions, but there, it was as if I completely regressed in age. I remember screaming at the nurses. I would hyperventilate when they locked the door to my room at night, and I was shut in there alone without human contact until the next morning without anything to do. And I could barely sleep. I would just lay awake in bed, crying and hyperventilating and shaking and begging for them to just unlock the door so I could sit in the hallway where I could see another human being and didn't have to be all by myself. It was without a doubt the worst time in my life. It scares me to know how crappy my personality can get when I'm trapped like that. I wasn't myself. I had no control. Eventually, I faked a recovery and lied and tried to only cry at night when I was alone so they would let me out of the hospital. I remember doing that for 2 days before I cried and had a panic attack and melted down during the day. And once again, had a meltdown because I thought if I showed any signs of not improving, they would never discharge me. The worst part was, this wasn't a 1 day long mental breakdown. It was a full week of never having any moments of peace. My heart was constantly racing, and I never settled down into the environment like the other patients did. I didn't know that level of panic and anxiety was even sustainable, but it was. Even when I did manage to sleep, it was nightmares. 0 out of 10 experience, would not recommend. After that, I vowed I would never try to unalive myself again, because the possibility of failing and ending up in that place again seemed worse than the possibility of living a crappy life outside of the hospital. Story 45. I had one last night. It was the worst of my life. I was trembling and sobbing and hyperventilating for almost 30 minutes. My teeth were chattering and my hands were rattling, but I wasn't cold. My boyfriend had to basically give me a shower to calm me down. It was awful. PTSD is no joke, and that's what being triggered looks like. Not when you're mildly upset about something or your friend is being oversensitive. Story 46. My grandfather had cancer, and at a pretty bad stage. One Sunday morning, when I was in high school, the phone rang and it was my step-grandmother. She had called to tell my mom that we should come right away. She apparently made it sound urgent, like Grandpa was on his deathbed, and we should come see him before he died. I remember Mom waking me up and being super serious while telling me we're not going to church. We were going to my grandpa's instead. He wasn't doing well. I should prepare myself, etc. We got to his place and he's fine. I mean, he's still got cancer, but he's up and about and absolutely fine. We had a pleasant time. My mom was downright giddy for a while because she was so relieved. On the way home, driving on a highway, I can actually feel her getting angry beside me, like physically. She's tensing up and gripping the steering wheel. And then, quite suddenly, she just starts screaming. Wordless screams at first, then what at first seemed like random words, some of them curse words, which I didn't think I'd ever heard my mom say before. She lets go of the wheel and puts her head in her hands, pulling at her hair, still screaming. I grab the wheel and start yelling, "Slow down! We have to pull over! Stop!" I don't know how long this went on for. It felt like forever, but it was probably just a few seconds, as evidenced by the fact that I'm still alive. We were on a major highway. This was terrifying. She does pull over, but doesn't stop screaming. Eventually, her screams are coherent enough for me to understand. Basically, her stepmother, my grandpa's wife, had made her think her father was dying in order to get her to come over. She thought that Mom would say no because it was a Sunday, and we always went to church. She was probably right. Mom almost certainly would have said no, but she probably would have happily come after church. So over the course of the morning, Mom had gone from mentally preparing herself to see her father on his deathbed, trying to prepare me for that, to being giddy and ecstatic that he was fine, to realizing that her stepmother had used her fear of her father's death to manipulate her and she just snapped. And just to point out, my grandpa outlived my step grandmother. He lived for another 3 years after this. She died 2 years after this incident. It was madness. Story 47. This might be a bit long, but I'm really hoping someone can read this and understand what I'm going through, because I've never really, truly expressed this. Maybe someone can give me some insight. I have a long history of obsessive and compulsive behavior. Now, my family has denied this for many years, since I'm not a neat freak. A lot of people think OCD means you clean constantly. And because I'm not the you touched my ear, now I have to touch my other ear type of OCD. I suffer from intrusive thoughts. It affects my functioning. It's why I use things like Reddit, actually. I like to comment on things, and if I don't check my comments, I feel like something's going to happen. It's compulsive. I wish I didn't have this. It affects my work, too. I check my sales numbers maybe 30 times a day, even when I know 100% my sales are fine. I check the time constantly. If I have a few days off, I've been known to leave a shift at 9 p.m., then think, I need to make sure I sent that email / finished that sale / did that other thing, and then make a U-turn, go back to my office, have security let me in, make up a lie, I left my phone charger, then sit down and do my work, only to find that I did in fact send that email. I did finish that sale, and I didn't make a huge mistake that's going to blow up in my face when I come back to work. My boss would have a effing fit if he knew I did this. Even at the gym, I've noticed certain things that I do that my friends and my trainers pointed out, like I can't stop thinking about how I'm going to fall off of something, or if I'm doing a plyometric exercise, I can't stop focusing on the idea that something is behind me and I'm going to hit it, even if I moved everything, even if I'm looking in the mirror, things like that. I also can't tell you the number of times I thought I was having an aneurysm, heart attack, or appendicitis. I'm always worried I have an immediate health concern. So, to my breakdown. A few weeks ago, I left a comment on Reddit. It was a story about someone. It was relevant to the topic. A lot of people did not like what I wrote. Actually, they didn't like how I handled the situation. The story was very, very specific. I kept reading those comments and I thought, those people don't know what they're talking about. They weren't in my shoes. They're behind a keyboard. But the more I read the comments, I actually started to get worried that someone was going to dig and find out who I was talking about. I didn't give location or a name or anything like that, but I realized if someone wanted to really, really dig, they could find out who that person was. Next thing I know, I'm deleting every trace of that comment. Every comment that suggests which city I live in, because I'm thinking, oh my god, I could get sued for libel. The thoughts would not go away. Mind you, I was off work for 3 days, so I didn't even have work to distract me from the constant thoughts of, holy crap, my life is over. I actually made myself physically sick. I started looking up libel and slander laws, what the consequences are, how it could affect my career down the road, the statute of limitations, what to do, how to protect myself. Every few hours I would think, this is stupid, nothing's going to happen. I would suppress the thought, and then not long after it would come back with a vengeance and the panic would come back. My stomach ache would come back. I'd start Googling again, etc. On a rational level, I know this is a stupid thing to worry about. It's a comment on Reddit. It's nothing. In the middle of my breakdown, I called my friend, who I knew wouldn't judge me, and he calmed me down. I mentioned that I said something about someone and it was going to F me up, and that I started going even further about my childhood. All sorts. I eventually got over that. I feel pretty stupid that I even spent time on this at all, but I think my mind was in a dark place and decided to latch on to whatever was happening at the time, which happened to be something as stupid as a Reddit comment. The other thing that happened to me, even as recently as a week ago, is that I started having another episode of intrusive thoughts, this time about violent, awful stuff. I have become obsessed with the subreddit no sleep type of stuff. I watch a lot of horror online. I don't want to watch these things. I have to. As a result, when I have intrusive thoughts like violence, gore, etc., I have a memory of all this stuff I've watched. It's like my brain now has an entire library of awful things to think about. It's torture. I don't know why I do this at all. It led to another breakdown last weekend. All I could think about were awful, horrible things. I tried thought-stopping techniques, which of course did nothing. The anxiety went on for 3 days. So I am going to suggest the obvious here, but say, maybe you need to look into getting some therapy, maybe a roommate, maybe having someone there living with you that you can converse with on the daily, on the reg, would help with these impulsive thoughts that you keep getting and, appetites that you need to constantly satiate. Story 48. My mother, she snapped completely and was going to unalive me and then herself. I was 17. She'd been acting scary enough that I'd already hidden all the knives. She had always been abusive and violent, but this seemed extra scary, and this was before everyone had cell phones. So I had no way to call for help. It was terrifying looking into her eyes and seeing absolutely nobody home. Usually, when she hurt me, it was still her, She'd either be raging out or have this sick, dark joy in her eyes. But she was just empty, no humanity. After a few minutes of searching for the missing knives, she slapped me around a little. I didn't resist at all, hoping that she would be satisfied if she hurt me a little, and then she stormed back outside. About 20 minutes later, she came back in, calm and acting like nothing happened. Story 49. Sisters were both SA'd by my father growing up. I was 5 when he went to jail, and the next 8 years were hell for us. My sisters would try to unalive themselves about one every couple of months. Tons of terrifying memories, but one in specific still gets me. We were in the apartment. My mom was outside at the car. I'm 8 years old, just chilling around the house. I come around the corner after hearing some screaming. There's my middle sister holding my oldest sister in a headlock. My oldest sister has the bottle of bleach and is trying to drink it. Both are yelling. My middle sister yells to get my mom. I run and get my mom. My mom runs to the freezer, gets the sheets that are wet and frozen. We tackle my oldest sister to the ground and wrap her in the sheet. My middle sister calls 911 while my mom and I lift my sister in the blanket and rock her back and forth. About what felt like an eternity later, the ambulance shows up. My oldest sister is still screaming as the paramedics tie her to the gurney. Our therapist thankfully had shown up and was trying to get her to calm down. This was just one of the scariest moments of my life. Both are great and thriving, and we're all still in therapy. Story 50. My own. 2014, I started feeling super weird, like something was off. Started hearing voices, mostly my own name, but other stuff too. As time went on, I continued feeling very strangely. In November, I was in the shower, and suddenly the walls started melting on top of me. My hair was on fire, and my bones were shattering inside my skin. I couldn't move for 10 minutes. As far as I knew, the whole world was breaking into pieces, and everyone I knew was dead. This happened again 30 minutes later while I was driving, but far worse. Turns out, I was developing severe panic disorder, which was the start of schizophrenia. I'm still pretty high functioning, but my life is a shadow of what it was before. I miss it, but I have to learn to like the new way of life too. TLDR, mental illness is a scary place. Seek help and recognize it can take years to get to a safe place again. Story 51. I have bipolar disorder. A few years after I was diagnosed, I had a manic episode. Although I had been taking my meds, I became very paranoid. I had visual hallucinations. Most were just movement out of the corner of my eye, but then I started to see the same truck in my rearview mirror no matter where I was driving. Not a small truck, but a large, menacing semi. I also heard whispers all the time that I couldn't quite understand. I ended up in the hospital for several weeks. Story 52. I was hospitalized for wanting to self-unalive a month or two ago, so naturally I saw a lot of crap, but this breakdown was the worst I've seen. There was this patient who had psychosis. They were purely episodes, so I had never seen anything abnormal before. We were playing a game of cards in the hall when she started saying really weird things, like, "My family tried to kill me. They're evil." I didn't think much of it because I don't know her story. Then her eyes practically rolled back in her head, and she started screaming and trying to hit me. I started freaking out and pushed the alarm. Nurses came running, trying to drag her away from me, but she kept screaming and biting anyone who tried to get near her. I was frozen. I couldn't stop watching her claw the walls and hit the nurses. They had to restrain her and give her a shot to calm down. The worst part is that while they were trying to restrain her, she was begging for help. "No, please, I'm sorry, I won't do it again." That was the part of the incident that really effed me up the most. It was horrific to see someone lose touch with reality in practically seconds. I still think about it a lot and how scary it was. I hope she's doing better. Story 53. I haven't thought of this in years, but it's one of the wildest things I've ever witnessed. I'm in the 2nd grade. Our desks arranged in cubes of 4. Across from me is seated a girl. I think her name was Ashley. I don't really know her that well, but she seems as normal as any other 2nd grader to me. It's the middle of the afternoon. We're doing some kind of art project. She has some kind of snack in like a gallon-sized Ziploc bag. I think it was trail mix or something. Ashley finished the snack, but left the bag out. No big deal, except our teacher takes exception to this and tells Ashley to either put the bag away or throw it out. Ashley refuses both options, so the teacher pulls the adult card and takes the bag from her. Bad move. Ashley loses her crap instantly, screaming, crying, protesting in spurts of syllables that might have been words had they come from someone who wasn't now convinced the world is over. I've never seen someone lose it like this in my short time on this planet. And now I've got a front row seat in the effing Thunderdome. Ashley is scream crying. Our teacher looks like she just stepped on a landmine. Ashley wails, flails, and tries to rip the bag out of teacher's hands, but teacher somehow hangs onto it. They seem to stalemate for several minutes until teacher remembered she's way stronger than a effing second grader and completely seizes the bag, which she then tosses in the trash. Wrong move. If the previous tantrum was bad, the ensuing fit was apoplectic. We had now entered the atomic age of losing your crap, and Ashley was our Manhattan Project. I think she's trying to speak, but it's just wails and crying at this point, with the occasional flash of fury directed at the teacher. Our whole class has come to a standstill as we soak in this incredible sight. After about 20 minutes, Ashley is finally sent to the hallway to calm down. She grabbed the bag out of the trash on the way out, and no one tries to stop her. I don't know where you are now, strange, angry girl who loves plastic bags, but I hope you still bring shock and awe at the most unexpected times. Should we be actually hoping that she's still bringing shock and awe at the most unexpected of times? I don't know about that. I know you're probably just joking, OP, but had to call that out a little bit. We don't want that. Story 54. My own. I suffer from severe anxiety, major depressive disorder, and at the time also had postpartum depression. There was a point where everything would trigger me. I was a walking panic attack. My biggest meltdown involved a panic-induced hallucination that had me sincerely believing that my husband was going to kidnap our children and leave me. Fortunately, I'm much better now. I'm on the night meds and in therapy, so life has improved. Story 55. Used to live on a campus and school in Switzerland. One Indian girl in one of the dorms started saying that she was seeing things, and then it escalated into this presence touching her at night. She even started speaking in Romanish, which is one of the official languages of Switzerland, but no one really speaks it anymore as it's that old. Freaking out more by the day until finally her parents and one of their spiritual masters flew in from India to their room to try and heal her. Nope, she went worse and they had to take her out of school. Later, we found out that years and years before, the area where the campus was used to be a farm where people spoke Romanish. Add to that, it then became a graveyard before the school went on top of it. Story 56. Work at a hotel, and a couple of years ago, we had this high school reunion booked for an upcoming weekend. A few days before this group's arrival, one of the ladies in the party called me, told me in the whiniest voice her reservation was wrong. When I saw that she was with the reunion, panic set in. Oh no, did we book the entire group in the wrong dates? No, that wasn't it. Since she was booked under the block, by default all of the rooms were booked for the 2-day weekend. It's possible, and likely, that whoever made her specific reservation just forgot to adjust the dates to simply 1 day instead of 2. She started bawling, crying on the phone to me, that we booked her for 2 days and she wasn't able to make the first night. She'd only be able to come in the last night for 1 night only, which again was fine. It was an oversight on our behalf. That's a quick fix on the computer. But she just lost it on the phone, just crying that she couldn't come in the first night and almost acted like it was an affront to her, or an insult that we accidentally kept her in the 2 nights. I don't know what her deal was, but I corrected the reservation to reflect a 1-night stay for just her room only and sent her corrected confirmation. But after I hung up, I just shook my head in disbelief. Why was she so upset and have a mental breakdown over accidentally extending her stay? I do not remember any issues with her during their stay. In fact, that reunion used our conference room and had a great party. They even offered me some of their leftover food when they were done. But dealing with that one lady a week or so before her arrival date was just baffling. Still don't get it. Story 57. Oh man, this is good. I was in clinicals for my paramedic license. While I was in the hospital, we got a psych patient who was in complete psychosis, screaming at the walls, screaming about the devil, screaming about the president. Man, he was out there. The funniest part about it was when one of the nurses called him Gary. It was like an instant snap to reality where he said, "Don't call me Bear, that's a sissy name," then went right back to screaming. Good stuff. Story 58. My own. I'd been struggling at work for a while for a number of reasons and ended up being signed off for 2 weeks to try and get some rest. I knew I wasn't ready to go back to work, but I was so terrified that I would be fired if I was off, which would have destroyed us financially, that I went back anyway and lasted a month. My last day in work, I remember crying on the train on the way in, but it felt like I was outside my body watching myself, if that makes sense. I remember thinking that I passed 2 shops on my way to work and could get 2 boxes of paracetamol in each shop on the way in to work and 2 more from each shop on the way home, so I'd have 8 boxes of 16, which should be enough to finish the job. I couldn't stop crying while I was in the office, and eventually the woman who sat next to me told my manager, who took me into a room with HR, and they sent me home. I went to my doctor the next morning and was off completely for 3 months in total, and it took me almost a year before I was able to work full time again. Thankfully, I'm doing much better now with the right balance of medication, and even though we have a lot of family stuff going on, I'm able to deal with it and still function, which is a huge improvement. Story 59. Friend of mine was bipolar. Her mood swings started getting more and more extreme, to the point where there's a concern she's a danger to herself and others, due to a couple of questionable incidents. Her roommate and I convince her during a low period to check herself into the VA hospital for treatment. I drive her there. She sees a physician who agrees she needs to be admitted and is in the middle of the paperwork when she suddenly flips high and decides to nope out, finding me and demanding I drive her home. I walk her around the hospital and parking lot for an hour, pretending I couldn't find the car, hoping that she'll swing back down and go back to admission. After she decides to hitchhike back, I suddenly remember where I park, having made a phone call back to her roommate. I drive her back to her apartment where her roommate and father are waiting. The 3 of us literally carry her back to my car. The whole way back, she's struggling and screaming that she's going to kill us all, and we drive her back to the hospital where her father gets her involuntarily committed. I try to visit her in the hospital, but get a message relayed that she doesn't ever want to see or talk to me again. I hope she got the help she needed. Story 60. My own. Granted, I've had a few that most of my family have seen at different points, but this is my own worst. I was about 18, working my first job. I was nearing on 2 years, and as someone with severe social anxiety from before I could speak, that's an incredible feat that, due to this incident, basically turned back the clocks, and I had turned into a literal hermit for about a year. So I was working drive-thru, and I had been given a bagged order. I checked it, folded it up, and handed it out. It was the nighttime rush, and I moved slow, so I didn't notice that the bag had 2 fries and a burger, instead of 1 fry and a burger. This guy was so outraged he had a second fry right off the bat. I checked his receipt, and he wasn't charged for it. So as pleasantly as I could, I told him it's his, free of charge, in an attempt to not bother the managers and keep the line moving. But for some reason, this guy was just so pissed off that he got a free fry and how we apparently never get anything right that he took the sandwich, which apparently was right, unwrapped it, and threw it at me. Oddly, not the first time this happened to me at this job. And at that point, I just froze. The guy had drove off. My managers had taken notice, and worst of all was that it was the last few minutes of my shift, and my mom was watching me work, waiting to bring me home, and she was standing next to my store supervisor, and I really felt like an 8-year-old trying to win the soccer match with my mom there. She's always been supportive of me, but due to my social anxiety, never has had high hopes for me achieving much, if it includes just about any personal interaction with acquaintances/strangers. I felt my world stop. I felt everyone's eyes on me. Everyone saw what happened, including the customers, and just kind of stared to see what I would do. My coworker leaned over and patted me on the back and asked if I was okay. I turned to look at my mom, and she looked so sympathetic, like a "you're doing great" look, which made me break. At the same time, my supervisor leaned over to my mom and said, "They can be so cruel," referencing the customers. The whole time, I was just trying not to cry. I tried to insist on staying the last 4-some minutes left of my shift, but my supervisor insisted I go, with the agreement of my mom. I ended up on the couch for 6 months. I got up once a day, when I woke up, to pee, and gather a stock of drinks and food on the table so I wouldn't have to get up. My mom, who's usually not tolerable of self-pity and all that, unless in exceptional cases like major depression, would come home with various treats that I knew she couldn't afford. I had made up a lame excuse to my manager why I needed to be put off the schedule for a bit. They told me to take as much time as I needed, but then 6 months later I was still floundering when they called. I didn't answer, and they left a voicemail telling me that I needed to call back to discuss the future at the job, whether I was quitting or coming back. I called back immediately and quit. I also quit private Japanese lessons due to this, since I couldn't afford it. And oddly, whenever I remember this in my memory, as soon as the burger hit me and he drove off, my mind suddenly places me behind my mom and supervisor, witnessing their conversation while also watching a rigid me at my station. Obviously not how it went, but somehow the only way I remember it.